There's a saying that every action must have an equal and opposite reaction. And the world of wrestling is pretty similar in that respect too, as it happens. Why is this? Well, if you look hard enough, you're probably going to find a mirror version of any of the major gimmicks out there somewhere. But what are the biggest examples of such a phenomenon? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us now as we take a deep dive into Mirror Images, wrestling's opposite gimmicks. And if we're going to start anywhere, why not do so with one of the most obvious examples, as when Mordecai was first introduced to WWE audiences in 2004, he was pretty much designed to be an anti-Undertaker right off the bat. Yes, given the nature of his character, Mark Calaway has been no stranger to taking on a strange variety of opponents over the years, opponents who simply wouldn't work in any other context outside of a feud with him. But while the likes of Giant Gonzalez, Kane, and Kamala all had varying degrees of success, they weren't specifically written to be his exact opposite. No, that wouldn't happen until Kevin Thorne got signed up to a contract in the mid-2000s and was offered the role of Mordecai. Who was Mordecai? Well, he was a religious zealot who believed he was the one to bring righteousness to the world. And the way he planned to do this was to deck himself out in all white and fight for his god in his own twisted and ultimately incorrect way. It should be obvious to anyone paying attention then why this served as a perfect counterpoint to The Undertaker, as with that character dressing in all black and seemingly being possessed by some kind of demonic entity at times, it made the two feel like a perfect fit for one another. And this was the initial plan, as it turned out, with the goal being to build Mordecai up over a period of a few months en route to an eventual WrestleMania showdown with the Dead Man. Unfortunately though, as those months went on, it became clear Kevin Thorne wasn't performing at the standard which was expected of him, and so because of this, the plug would be pulled on the feud before it ever got started. Still, at least it wasn't the end of the world, because he would eventually get to return as a more vampire-themed character a couple of years later. And as far as the Heaven versus Hell idea, well, that was eventually repurposed and used as part of the feud between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 25 instead. Of course, The Undertaker isn't the only brother of destruction who's had to deal with comparisons to an opposite gimmick over the years. Luckily, in the case of Kane though, he never had to fight his mirror image, as they were locked over in WCW at that point under the name of Glacier. That's right, well, we may have gotten to see Fire and Ice face off in the form of X-Men's Pyro and Iceman, or the Fire and Water Nation battles in Avatar: The Last Airbender, we've still yet to see such a thing take place inside the squared circle. Not that the two perfect people for such a feud don't exist though, because with the Big Red Machine seemingly representing the flames of hell themselves, and Ray Lloyd not being afraid to show mid-90s WCW fans exactly what was cooler than being cool, it was almost as if they were made for one another. Sure, Glacier wasn't exactly an original idea even at the time, as he was basically a straight ripoff of Mortal Kombat's Sub-Zero. But then Kane was, in many ways, a ripoff of Michael Myers as well, so who are we to judge? What we will say is that it's a crime the invasion didn't come a few years earlier, as seeing these two larger-than-life comic book-esque figures squaring off would have been a treat for fans everywhere. Now don't get us wrong, we're not saying the matches would have been good or anything, but at least the build would have been something to witness, as it would have likely featured some out-there effects and crazy visuals, even by the standards of turn-of-the-millennium wrestling. Hell, someone like Vince Russo could have really had a field day with this one, as it would have fit in perfectly with the often crazed and eye-catching style of storytelling he leaned into so much. That said, we're pretty sure if he had ever been in charge of such an angle, his own polar opposite would have had a fair few things to say about it. Who are we talking about here? Why, Jim Cornette, of course. Yes, while neither of these two are wrestlers, they still make this video because they're so wildly on the opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to their philosophies on the business that we couldn't not include them. Basically, Jim Cornette is about as old school as they come, with him continuing to harken back to the days of the 70s and 80s territory style, often to a fault. Obviously then, this has seen a lot of people criticize him for being out of touch and unable to move on with the times, with one of the people who believes this being Vince Russo himself. But then why wouldn't Russo believe this? After all, his whole thing in the 90s was trying to push wrestling into a new generation by adopting a more Crash TV style of show. That said, while this worked out well in the short term, eventually it became clear such a method just wasn't sustainable. And when his ideas eventually got too crazy even for wrestling fans, you'd better believe Jim Cornette was there to remind him how he'd been right about such a process all along. Now, we're not here to argue about which person is correct in the ongoing war between the two, but whichever side of the coin you fall upon, it's undeniable seeing the rivalry unfold over the years between the two has been entertaining, sometimes more entertaining than what's happening in modern-day wrestling at any given time. Not that there is nothing worth watching on modern-day Raw, though. No, outside of acts like the Judgment Day, we also recently had a great odd couple duo who pretty much served as the exact opposites of one another, and that's the team of Randy Orton and Matt Riddle. Of course, given Randy Orton's long-term absence from the ring due to injury, it remains unclear if this one will ever get the payoff it deserves. That said, when it was cooking, it was one of the best angles the Red brand had seen in a long time. Why was this? Well, with the Viper being the very picture of stoicism, a man who loved nothing more than to pop on a headlock in the middle of a match and slow the pace down for a while, and with Matt Riddle being basically the excitable best friend who always wanted to get the party started no matter what, the two clashed in the best possible way once they started teaming up in 2021. Sure, it probably should have never worked in hindsight, but something magical took place when they were in the ring together anyway. An alchemical reaction which could never have been otherwise predicted. And because of that, RK-Bro, as they soon became known, started getting over in a big way with fans before long, so much so that after a while, people were begging for them to stay together forever, and for Orton to not do what we all knew was coming and turn on his new best friend come the end of things. And that's why it's become a bit of a tricky situation in recent months then, as with the Knoxville native's return to the ring at all seemingly being in doubt, he might never get the chance to hit Riddle with an RKO at all. That said, if this is the case, it also means they'll always remain a team in fans' hearts, one of the rare odd couple teams who ultimately never came to blows, in fact. Yes, we'd rather see a conclusion to the story in some form, even if it does end in heartbreak, because leaving it unfinished is always going to be more frustrating. And there's definitely the sense that both parties, with their wildly contrasting gimmicks, could still do more with the whole thing if they could just be given a few more months to work with. But then there's always going to be a sense that more could be done by a performer when their career is snuffed out too soon. And if you need any evidence of this, you just have to look to our next subject, Bret Hart, and his own opposite, the man many hold responsible for putting him on the shelf permanently, Bill Goldberg. Quick, grab a microphone, find the Hitman, and ask him who he hates the most in the world. There's a good chance his answer will be Goldberg. Honestly, it's become such a meme at this point that we're pretty sure he's just trolling us with such answers now. Of course, even if the 5-time WWF champion is only having a bit of fun, it's undeniable that there's some heat there, as it was during a match on the December 13th, 1999 episode of Nitro that an errant super kick from Bill severely concussed Bret and caused him to have to retire from the ring just a few weeks later. And what makes this all the worse is that the Canadian was always someone who took pride in the fact that he wrestled such a safe and professional style. He never injured a single person throughout his career. And that's where the real differences in these two performers shine through the most as it happens, because while Goldberg was always more of a powerhouse who threw himself at other performers with all the power of a wild horse, the Hitman was more calculating in his technique. Really, it's like comparing a chess grandmaster to a man with a sledgehammer. One was all about patience and building towards something in a quiet and intellectual manner, and the other was about causing as much destruction as possible in as short a space of time as he could. Not that there's anything wrong with either of these methods, of course. No, both can be fun to watch under the right circumstances. But given the differences, it's easy to see how the two never exactly gelled in the ring. And it's also easy to see how accidents were able to happen so easily then, and an injury which should have been avoided was allowed to take place at all. Still, even if this mirror image of two in-ring performers did end in tragedy somewhat, it's not like every such incident has to go the same way. No, sometimes rather than become rivals, a pair of seemingly polar opposite figures can become best of friends. And we're not talking about a short-term thing like RK-Bro either here, because so popular was The Rock and Mick Foley's partnership back in the 90s, it's still talked about fondly to this day. That's right, it's time to discuss the Rock and Sock connection, arguably the greatest odd couple double act of all time, and the one every other is now compared to. But then why wouldn't it stand out so much, as it featured two of the most popular wrestlers of all time, and two who couldn't have seemed more different from one another at first glance? Take The Rock, the great one, the people's champion, the man who at the turn of the millennium was pretty much the picture of cool. he was funny, he was confident, and he dressed well. Basically, every guy at the time wanted to be him, and every girl at the time wanted to be with him. Then on the other end of the spectrum you have Mankind, the perennial weirdo and underdog, someone who didn't exactly look like a world champion and who certainly didn't have the cool factor others around him might have, but who was so charming and beloved by fans that he found himself in a permanent spot on the card anyway. Really, it was like if the captain of the high school football team and the loser kid who did nothing but play Dungeons and Dragons all day were suddenly forced to coexist. No one could have foreseen good things happening. But against all odds, good things did indeed start happening once they formed the Rock and Sock Connection in mid-1999, as despite the Great One taking a while to warm up to his new partner, eventually, even he was won over by his naive charisma. And this led to some of the greatest WWF moments of all time then, with perhaps the most notable thing being the now iconic This Is Your Life segment on September 27th of that year. Hell, so strong was their bond at a certain point, it continued on all the way up until WrestleMania 20 when, in what turned out to be his last WWE appearance for 7 years, The Rock once more teamed up with his old friend Mick to take on Evolution. Even to this day, in fact, the two appear to be on good terms in real life, with each occasionally making reference to how much fun they had together in interviews. Of course, not all mirror image acts have the luxury of having so much fun together though, which was something Val Venis found out the hard way when he was forced to join the Right to Censor in 2000. But wait, what was the story with this one? Well, it all goes back to 1998, as that was when, right as the Attitude Era was picking up steam, Vince Russo decided what the WWF really needed to take it to the next level was a wrestling adult film star. And sure, this might seem wild by today's standards, but back then, in a world where wrestling pimps and elderly women giving birth to hands was the norm, it fit right in without anyone ever having to blink an eye. So it was then that for the next 2 years, Val Venis became a top draw of the mid-card division, with him getting into more than a couple of notable storylines. That said, by the time 2000 came around, the raunchy on-screen product of the New York-based company was starting to get some pushback from parents groups. And because of that, there were increased calls to remove characters like Venis from TV altogether if the show was going to be largely marketed towards children. How would Vince McMahon respond to this? Well, by creating a parody of such activist groups called the Right to Censor, with his version being a stuck-up collective of ultra-right conservatives led by Steven Richards, who wanted nothing more than to stop everyone from having fun at all costs. Of course, once the RTC debuted then, it didn't take long for them to aim their crosshairs at the Big Valboski specifically, as to them, he represented the worst of the worst when it came to the cesspool of filth WWF had become. Hell, over the course of their battles together, they'd even at one point force him to join up with their cause, something which led to Val having to cut his hair, wear a shirt and tie, and drop any references to his prior adult entertainment career. Needless to say then, this wasn't something he was happy about both on-screen and off-screen, as it meant anything which made him stand out was now gone. But it could have been worse. He could have been having to take part in battles with a man twice his size, which is exactly the situation our next subject, Rey Mysterio, found himself in when he first came up against his own opposite, The Big Show. Yes, we know this is an obvious one, but we're going to include it anyway because what two things stand out more as a mirror image of one another than a 7-foot-tall giant and a 5'6" luchador? Honestly, just the visual of this one alone makes it worthwhile, as whenever the pair were on screen together during the 2000s and 2010s, it never failed to impress. But then that was also because while it may have seemed like a one-sided fight on the face of things, Rey was always able to put up a challenge against his far larger opponent, as with his near-peerless in-ring skills, he frequently managed to find a way around the size difference. And this even led to him beating the Big Show on a number of occasions, a move which only served to make him that much more popular with fans as a result. Not that the Big Show didn't get his fair share of victories too. No, more than once he was able to best his smaller rival just through sheer power and strength alone. But really, it didn't matter who won in the end. Rather, the fun part was always about watching the two square off in a series of David versus Goliath style battles repeatedly over the years. And these battles might not be over even now as it happens, because with Rey still being an active member of the WWE roster, and Paul White occasionally lacing up his boots for AEW, both are ready to go if need be. Sure, as it stands, this would require a modern-day invasion-style angle we don't think we're likely to see anytime soon, but we can always dream, can't we? And if we're not going to dream about seeing one more Big Show Rey Mysterio encounter, We can alternatively dream about another final bout between two legends who pretty much served as the antithesis to each other during the early 2010s. Who are we talking about this time? Why, who else but CM Punk and John Cena? Basically, this one all comes down to a war of philosophies, as back during the heights of the PG era, Big Match John was the one flying the flag for Vince McMahon's Sports Entertainment Spectacular, and the way he was doing so was to play a very child-friendly character in a very child-friendly world, someone who would have fit in better with an episode of Blue's Clues or the Teletubbies than he would have a Territory era style fight. Enter CM Punk, an iconoclast who felt like the time had come for a change and that he was the very man to bring this about. The way he saw it, in fact, through his leadership, WWE was ready to move into a whole new phase, one called the reality era, which would see him at its helm as a far more adult-based star. Obviously, only one man could come out on top in this battle then, and it was that very thing which made their showdown so exciting to watch. It didn't matter if it was their 5-star classic at Money in the Bank 2011, their pretty underrated return bout at the following month's SummerSlam, or their famous piledriver match on Raw early the next year. Each encounter had a level of tension to it on account of what was at stake. And while Cena would ultimately come out the victor during this program, you could argue both men won in a way, as since then both WWE and Punk's current home AEW have both returned to a somewhat more realistic adult style of TV show. Sure, there are still silly elements in both promotions, such as the Maximum Male Models or Orange Cassidy, but those examples are so much fun, we wouldn't have it any other way if we had the chance. No, at the end of the day, pro wrestling is a variety show, and there's always room for a bit of everything on a well-balanced program. Hell, there's also plenty of room for the spookier side of the industry too if it's done well. And in recent years, few, if any, have done this better than our next subject, Bray Wyatt, and the two opposite sides of his character, the kid-friendly TV show host from the Firefly Funhouse, and the monstrous nightmare figure that is The Fiend. Yes, we're doing a 2-for-1 this time because both of these characters were played by the late great Wyndham Rotunda. That said, they couldn't be further from each other in their nature, which is exactly what makes the whole gimmick so interesting. Really, you could argue they represent two different aspects of the character's psyche, the part which wants to bring some joy into the world, and the part which wants to watch it all burn to the ground. Basically, the part that wants to hurt, and the part that wants to heal. And that's the intensity of the war between these aspects, which seems to have quite literally split him in two at some point, as each became manifest into their own separate person. Now clearly, if you're looking for the one who's the most obviously dangerous out of these two, then it's The Fiend, because, as we've seen, whenever he hits the ring, he's pretty much an unkillable monster for the most part, similar to the way The Undertaker was back in the early 90s. But that doesn't mean his Mr. Rogers-esque opposite isn't one who should be watched either, though in the case of that character, it's more his mouth you have to be wary of than his muscles. And that's because he uses his words to manipulate and twist reality in a way that lures his opponents in and psychologically weakens them to the point they're ripe for the picking, ripe enough to be thrown into the funhouse itself and temporarily deleted from reality, as happened to John Cena at WrestleMania 36. That said, for as bad as all this is, the real danger comes when both of these figures work together, with the TV show host softening things up and The Fiend being there to deliver the killing blow. Whenever they were able to do such a thing, in fact, there was really no one who could stand in their path. Tragically though, Bray's sudden and shocking death at just 36 years old has meant he'll never finish the story he started. Still, he'll always rank as one of the best wrestlers of all time, and a great example of a mirror image set of gimmicks.